Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Nikkor 40mm f2. This is a full-frame Z-mount lens, and it provides a great alternative for those of you who want that normal angle of view. Actually, I find 40mm in many ways more useful than 50mm. Your mileage may vary, but it gives you a very compact, lightweight, and inexpensive option to cover that normal angle of view, making it a really intriguing lens, particularly at its current price point of about $230 US. I think it really makes more sense at that price than it does at $300, which is the MSRP. So is this 40mm f2 worth adding to your Z-mount kit, particularly when, as we've already looked at, there is a less expensive lens from Viltrox that does exist. Now, on that note, I will do a deeper dive into that and give you a comparison between these two lenses. I've shot a lot of head-to-head stuff, and so I will be back with another video at some point in the future to cover that as well. And so we'll dive into all of the details, however, about the Nikkor lens right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Fantom Duffel, a new unique convertible duffel bag that starts as a compact packable case that easily fits into your luggage or carry-on bag, but then converts into a 35-liter duffel. The exterior is made of 1680D ballistic nylon, which is tough and weatherproof. The interior has a high-visibility reflective finish that allows you to easily see what's inside, even in a dim hotel room. A large foam pouch on the side has a cable pass-through to allow for charging, and the removable straps use a fidlock system to easily and securely connect them. I've been using it for the gym, and it has room for my water bottle, a change of clothes, a basketball, my massive shoes, a towel, and a charger for my cell phone. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check it out and use code DUSTIN20 for 20% off when you're ready to check out.
So with this particular lens, as with one other Nikkor lens at this point, Nikon has actually released two different versions of the lens. There's the standard version that I'm evaluating here, and then also a special edition. It's really more of a cosmetic difference, but for about $20 more, you can get a lens that takes some retro styling cues back from Nikon's film era. So probably more appealing to those of you that have some nostalgia for lenses that looked a certain way. And so that is available to you. However, while it's only $20 difference in MSRP right now, there's a much bigger gap, at least in US pricing, where really you're paying more like $80 or $75 to $80 between the two. And so obviously it's definitely the value proposition to go with the normal one. Now, this lower price point of $230 US does place it in more direct competition with the Viltrox, which you can get for right under $160. But as we'll see in that video, there's definitely some give and take between the two, but some definite strengths for the Nikon lens. Now, one of those strengths isn't really the build quality itself. This is a very inexpensive lens from a first party. And so typically when you get an inexpensive lens from a first party, it means there's going to be some compromises. And one of the main compromises here is that this is definitely a plastic fantastic, up to and including the lens mount, which is frankly pretty rare in my experience these days. Basically only cheap first party lenses do I ever see a plastic lens mount. Everyone else, even if they're producing a $60 lens, will give it a metal lens mount. But such is life in the first-party lenses. Now, what is surprising, considering we don't even have a metal lens mount, is that there is some weather sealing included here. But even more surprising, it doesn't include the gasket at the lens mount, which is kind of like the basic thing. If a lens has very basic weather sealing, it typically has a gasket at the mount. In this case, no gasket at the mount, but about 4 seal points throughout the lens itself. So go figure. And so this has some weather sealing, though, you know, Nikon is a little bit ambiguous with the language as to how much you should trust that. For me, I'll happily use it out in rain, but I certainly wouldn't want to use it in kind of extreme conditions because I just don't think it's a professional grade of weather sealing there. Outside of that, there is nothing on the lens barrel itself, no switches, no buttons, just the control ring here. And so in this case, it's not just a manual focus ring. It can be assigned a couple of different functions. You could, beyond just manual focus, you could make it an aperture ring. You could make an exposure compensation dial. The ring itself moves pretty good. It has a decent amount of damping, and while it is, you know, it's rubberized threads here, it's, you know, there's nothing high end about it, but I do think the damping is of enough quality that the manual focus experience is reasonably good, and so I do appreciate that. This is a very compact and lightweight lens, even compared to the Viltrox lens, which is surprising since the Viltrox has a smaller maximum aperture of f2.5 versus f2. So in this case, the Nikkor lens is 70 millimeters in diameter. Basically, it starts with as wide as it needs to be to accommodate that lens mount, which is very large on the Z mount bodies, and then it just carries that through solid. And so it's 70 millimeters or 2.8 inches in diameter, but then it is very short. It's only 45.5 millimeters or 1.8 inches and extremely lightweight, weighing only 170 grams. That is 6 ounces. Up front, we have 52 millimeter front filter threads, but interestingly here, not only is there not a lens hood included, which by the way, the Viltrox does include a lens hood, but there's not even a bayonet for a typical lens hood to go on there. So if you're going to use some kind of third-party lens hood, you're actually going to have to use one that uses the filter threads to thread on, which certainly comes with its own kinds of inconvenience. So, that's something that I'm not necessarily delighted about. One area, however, that it is a kind of a cut above your typical budget lens, a lens like, say, the Canon RF 50mm f1.8, is that inside we actually have 9 curved aperture blades. And so a little bit more of a premium treatment for the aperture iris. Minimum focus distance here is 29 centimeters, which gives you a quite useful 0.17 times magnification. So again, there's some contradictions here. You've got weather sealing, you've got a nicer aperture iris, but you've got a plastic lens mount, you've got, the very most basic of features, not even designed really for a lens hood. It's a lens that does come with some inherent contradictions to it. Now, when it comes to autofocus, some of the same rules apply here. It is an STM or stepping focus motor, but it is quite a snappy one in this application. And I am actually pleasantly surprised by how fast autofocus is. And as you can see from the test, indoors or outdoors, it's pretty close to instantaneous in terms of making focus changes. Not only that, but the focus motor is nice and quiet. And I have to put my ear right next to it to make out even the slightest bit of noise that causes custom focus, and what you hear is a very, very light kind of shuffling as the focusing group moves back and forth there. For the most part, I found autofocus to be very precise. I would say shooting at large apertures, it's pretty much always precise. I did notice, however, shooting at smaller apertures, particularly when shooting landscapes, that sometimes focus seemed to have been in the right place, and then right at the moment of capture, focus would kind of jump back to where it was focused right at the beginning of the frame. So there'd be just this tiny little section of the scene in focus, and then most of the focus, or most of the scene out of focus, even though I was shooting at f5.6 or f8. Kind of an annoying trait that fortunately was not routine, but it did pop up more than once. I would say over the course of my review, I probably saw that 3 or 4 different times, and it pretty much ruins the shot when that takes place. So just something you might want to watch out for, and obviously it's probably going to help to have fewer points active. I like to shoot with, most of the time, with pretty much all the points active and then override if need be. And so in this case, moving ahead, I probably would override more often in that situation to make sure I got focus where I wanted. Now, on the video side of things, I found, again, a bit of a mixed bag. When it comes to the focus pulls, there's no lack of speed. Focus pulls jump back and forth very quickly, but what you'll also see is these micro pulses to where it will go backwards when it needs to go forward. And so you have this quick kind of pedaling back and forth before focus moves to the place that it needs to go. So that can be obviously a little bit of annoying, as it can pretty much ruin a shot if you've got a pull involved with it. Focus breathing is fairly low, as you can see from the shot. And then when you get out into the real world doing those same kind of focus pulls, I found that there was unfortunately some of those same pulses that would happen sometimes here with these, rose bushes. I was moving back and forth, and I got one of those pulses in there, which, I wasn't delighted about. I would say when it comes to my hand test that, again, it's a bit of a mixed bag, and that sometimes it made the transition fairly smoothly from my eye to my hand and vice versa. In other cases, it was really reluctant to move off my face to the hand, even though clearly the hand was the significant object in the frame and my face was not really visible. And so again, a bit of a mixed bag there. I found for real world focus changes, just kind of, pushing, not trying to do so much focus pulls, but just those natural transitions, there can be a little bit of abruptness there rather than this kind of cinematic transition that was nicely damped. It's a little too quick. You can help that a little bit by dialing down the speed of autofocus in the actual camera body, but it doesn't entirely eliminate that altogether. And so just something where this lens shows a little bit of its kind of budget roots when it comes to the autofocus system. So positives are it's fast, it's quiet, it's mostly accurate. For the video side of things, and sometimes in landscapes, it can just be a little bit abrupt and not do what you want it to do. So let's talk about image quality itself. I will give you the detailed image quality breakdown at the end of the review, but here's the overview. Optical formula here is 6 elements in 4 groups. Very simple. 2 of those elements are spherical elements, and so a very simple optical design for those of you that are fans of simple optical designs. The MTF chart is kind of ho-hum. I wouldn't be sold on this just based on the MTF chart, and the early reviews I had read before I had a chance to look at it suggested that the lens was better than the MTF chart suggests, and that is partially true, as we're going to see today. The Viltrox is definitely sharper, as you can see here, and in all of the side-by-side tests, the Viltrox is consistently the sharper lens of the two. The Nikkor, however, has definitely the nicer bokeh. So it really comes down to which you prefer. You don't get both here. You get either or with one of these lenses. Now, on some of the other technical sides of things, I found longitudinal chromatic aberrations, that's fringing before and after the plane of focus. They exist, but not strongly. There's more of a spherical aberration that robs the lens of a bit of contrast, particularly when you're up close to the subject. I found that lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame were pretty much non-existent, so very nice and clean in that regard. Distortion is low. There's just the tiniest degree of barrel distortion. I used a +2 to correct for. You could leave it uncorrected and probably never notice. However, vignette is really heavy. In fact, heavy enough that I don't think that the profile actually completely deals with it. I can definitely see a difference in the viewfinder on screen if I'm going from f2 to even f2.8 and beyond. The corners definitely brighten up, and I had to pretty much max out the sliders to eliminate it manually. You can see in this side-by-side comparison with corrections on that there is a huge difference between the way that a shot looks at f2 and f3.5. So vignette is definitely a factor here. It's heavy enough that even electronic wizard really can't entirely eliminate it. When it comes to the chart test, and that's looking at on a 45 megapixel at 200% magnification, I would say I was somewhat disappointed by what I saw at f2 on my chart test. I thought that the results might look a little bit better than what they did, and part of the reason for that is that I didn't feel that my real-world results looked quite as bad. Now, there was some give and take with that. What I found is that this lens does seem to be optimized for, let's say, 6 or 7 feet, a few meters, and further. Up close, I did feel like contrast was lower than what I would like, and there's some bleeding towards the edges. If I moved to a little bit more distant subject, I felt like contrast actually improved. And at infinity or landscape distances, I felt like the contrast looks pretty decent, and it was better in the corners when it comes to that. So ironically, I didn't find so much improvement by focusing in the corners, but I did find an improvement if I was shooting at distance. I found that there is some improvement by f2.8. Vignette starts to lift, contrast improves a little. More noticeable improvement by f4, and by f5.6 to f8, things are looking pretty fantastic all across the frame. I found that for shooting landscapes, f8 was actually the optimum aperture to shoot at if you want corner-to-corner sharpness. Diffraction does start to show up at f11 and more so at f16, which is minimum aperture, but I also felt like diffraction really wasn't the worst thing here. I felt like it handled diffraction a little bit better than what some lenses do. Really, the standout to me here optically is the bokeh quality, which is really very nice for a lens like this. I felt like it was soft, it was creamy, specular highlights were fairly round, not a lot of outlining to them, and as I noted, that was way better for me and my taste than what the Viltrox produces. Colors are good, as you would expect with a first-party lens, but even in an inexpensive lens like this, I felt like images had a richness to them. And so images actually look good almost always if you look at them on a global level, and depending on where focus was, how close the subject was, they would either look good or a little bit less good when looked at a pixel level, depending on some of those other factors I've already mentioned. Flare resistance was fairly good wide open, a little bit of veiling, a little bit of loss of contrast. When you stop down, you will see a little bit more of a ghosting pattern there, but fortunately it's not terrible since we don't have a lens hood here. It handles, I think, fairly good when it comes to that. So in conclusion, this really is an important lens in my opinion. Both Canon and Nikon in their offerings here, they've been, to this point, it's starting to change on Nikon, but to this point, it's been largely first-party options there. And so what that means is that the inexpensive lenses tend to be really important because if they're reasonably good, as I consider this lens to be, it's a way for a person to get a better optical performance than a kit lens, for example. Or if they want to travel light, this certainly qualifies for that. I think a lot of people enjoy this lens for street, for example. And so there are certainly things to recommend it. It's cheap, it's lightweight, it's better optics than the cheap zooms that you might get in kit. I think that it does make more of an argument for itself as a value lens at $230 rather than $300. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see prices kind of stay down at this point now that they have been discounted. And I think at that price, it really makes a pretty compelling argument for itself. Not as sharp as the Viltrox, but it has some other things that are definitely going for it. And again, I'll detail more of those in the head-to-head competition. So if you're looking for a kind of a standard or normal angle of view and you don't want to spend a ton of money, this is a great lens because it's so compact and lightweight. You can throw it in your bag and bring it along and have that alternate angle of view. So it's a lens that I actually intend to use myself and I am going to add and keep to my own personal kit. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you want more information, you can look at the full text review that is linked in the description down below. Also linkage there to an image gallery and some buying links if you'd like to purchase one. Now, if you're interested in a deeper dive into the optical performance, let's jump in together and see what we find.
Okay, so we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. So as noted, distortion itself is really, really low. You can see just the tiniest little bit of bulge there in the middle. I used a +2 to correct for it, and I got basically perfectly straight lines, so no big deal there. You can see vignette is a whole other issue, however. It is definitely not only strong in the corners, but you can see it penetrates pretty far into the frame, just giving the whole kind of frame a little bit of a dingy look. And you can see even pretty much maxing out the sliders that it took all of that and arguably just a hair more to fully correct for it. Now, in this case, both of these shots have the standard profile attached to them. And so you can see the f2 shot, it definitely still has kind of a bit of a vignette look to it, even after correction. And here at f3.5, all other things being equal, you can see just how much brighter everything looks towards the edges of the frame. So that goes to show that even the standard correction profile really doesn't completely eliminate that very heavy vignette. Now, when it comes to longitudinal chromatic aberrations, you can see particularly a little bit of green fringing after the plane of focus. You can also tell it's not really strongly pronounced. The shot here, for example, of these daisies, there's the potential for fringing around the edges. And what I see more so than a color fringing is more just probably just a spherical aberration to where there's just not quite perfect contrast, and so there's a little bit of bleeding at the edges, less than a kind of a bright color look. It's more just a bleeding that happens, so it's not a crisp transition from the light to the darker background. Now, when it comes to resolution and contrast, using a 45 megapixel Nikon Z8 body, this is at 200% magnification. You can see that in the center of the frame, that resolution and contrast is good, but not exceptionally so. It's just not really knock your socks off sharp for sure. Mid-frame actually looks a little bit soft to my eye. You can just see there's a lot of lacking contrast and just not a lot of fine detail. As we get down to the corner, it gets kind of progressively worse. This side not looking too bad, but by the time you get to the edge, it basically has fallen apart. Now, what's interesting, at least in this copy of the lens, I would argue that it's better on the left side of the frame than it is on the right. And so maybe not perfectly centered here, but you can see up here in the corner, even if this represents the stronger side, quote unquote, you can see that it definitely still is losing contrast towards the edges of the frame. Look at the black levels here compared to the black levels there. Now, if I compare this to the Viltrox 40mm f2.5 and put both lenses at f2.5, in the center of the frame, you can see that the Viltrox is sharper and more contrasty, not by a huge margin, but take a look at this writing here and compare it to what you see on the Viltrox. You can just see everything looks a little bit inkier. When we get to the mid-frame, however, it's a huge difference. I mean, you can see the Viltrox looks pretty flawless, whereas the Nikkor lens just looks pretty soft. If we look over on the left side where the Nikkor is better, we can see that the Viltrox is still better contrast and detail than what the Nikkor lens is. And if we compare this zone down here, you can see that, the Nikkor doesn't look bad, but the Viltrox does look a bit better. We look over on this side, and the difference is definitely more pronounced once again. Now going back just to the Nikkor lens, let's see how it does when you stop it down a bit. From f2 to f2.8, that stop, you can see contrast is definitely improved here in this zone. In the ship, you can see more detail. The writing is a little bit darker. Looking at the mid-frame, this mid-frame zone right here really looks not great. Down on this side, it is better, but you can see it's still not amazing. And we can see that there's improvement definitely to contrast. Vignette is starting to lift and looking better, but you can also still see that there's not a lot of great detail there in the corners of the frame. From f2.8 to f4, you can see that the corners start to improve with a little bit more improvement by f5.6, and then definitely more improvement by f8. By f8, things are looking pretty great here, though this zone in the mid frame is still kind of weak to my eye. It's better on this side, but it's actually not great as of yet. Down in this zone, you can tell that the mid frame is not the strength for this lens. This side looks pretty good at f8, and up into this corner is looking pretty good. Upper right corner is looking pretty good at f8 as well. As I noted earlier in the summary, however, I do think this lens performs better out at further distances than what I would for my chart test. So if I'm looking at this f2 image, and so obviously in the center of the frame, looks pretty good. And if I move off to the edge of the frame here, I can tell that it's softer, but it really doesn't look too bad. Certainly what I would consider usable. Likewise on this side, it looked quite usable right out to the edge of the frame. At the same time, if I compare to f5.6 and we revisit this, you can see how much it really has improved, how much brighter this edge looks, how much crisper the textures are. If we look even in the stones on the building, you can just see there's so much more detail that's present there over here on this bridge. And as we pan out towards the side, you can see, looking, for example, in this fallen tree back here, it's a little indistinct by comparison there, much crisper here. And so obviously this is a lens that does benefit from stopping it down. So returning to the chart for the moment, we can see that diffraction is starting to soften things a bit by f11, though not by a whole lot here. And by f16, it has softened yet more, but not nearly as extreme as what I see on some lenses. This is not too bad a performance when it comes to dealing with diffraction. So while we have a pretty decent level of magnification here, I'm not super impressed by the up-close performance. It just doesn't have a lot of detail and sharpness at f2. You can see in this real-world three-dimensional shot, I mean, there's a little bit of fringing there. That's not the major problem here. It's more just a lack of contrast up close where, there's some information there, but it doesn't really look crisp. If you move out just a little bit further, things start to improve, though you can see that the textures aren't exactly popping, but overall, I really like the look of the image. It's handled all these areas of transition to defocus, kind of these transition zones. They actually look quite good. This shot here, it's holding up well, and you can see that the shape of the specular highlights really looks quite good in that shot. Now, when it comes to flare resistance, you can see a little bit of ghosting and veiling, more like just some prismatic haze right there at the kind of epicenter of the sun. Here's another shot here, and you can see in this composition, there's a tiny bit of a ghosting pattern, but if it wasn't kind of a uniform background, you probably wouldn't see it. You stop the lens down. This is at f11. You can see that the ghosting pattern does become a little bit more pronounced, but never too bad. I never could produce much in terms of a sun star. That's not really a strength for this lens. This final shot here is one that I'll show in comparison to the Viltrox, and so we can see all the good and the bad here. So as far as the bad, the contrast and detail isn't spectacular here, but the backdrop and the bokeh is quite nice, and there's far less outlining than what we'll see on the Viltrox lens. I'm going to call the image quality performance here balanced rather than particularly strong in one direction or another.
Well, thanks as always. Still stick around to the very end, and I hope that the optical deep dive has illuminated some things for you and helped you to make a more informed buying decision. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.